we are back, the first content minded of the new year of 2026. And I figure that I definitely want to do more structured content with guests and also with specific topics. But I do think a significant portion of people that listen to the show want to return to form with a lot of long and sprawling podcasts that I'm often accustomed of doing, and hopefully that starting off the first episode of the year with a very meaty and very weighty topic that would honestly warrant multiple episodes and really is a topic du jour for futurists and people that write about technology and social media people. I wanted to discuss the potential future of artificial intelligence in combination with other technologies that for now seem like they're on the way out, either because they're too expensive or because people simply aren't interested in them, but maybe perhaps one day will be, or the technology will sufficiently democratize, quote unquote, enough to where they become accessible and they are not as burdensome. Specifically, VR technology, virtual reality technology, and the combination of the two. And also, I want to talk about in this podcast episode the erasure of the human, the problematization of the human, of bodies, and I might use more academy's theory type of language, but it's definitely very interesting with a few qualifications. But before I get to the qualifications and the general outline, and a lot of granted, before I get to that, let me just say, I've said it, a few times in various shorts and videos and streams, but Happy New Year, everybody. We're still in the beginning, we're approaching the middle of January, and this year has already been filled with various happenings, and we'll see what happens as we approach we're well into the middle period of the 2020s and what is going to happen. So, as always, like, share, subscribe, click the bell, and of course, the goodies, the substantial portion of this podcast will be behind the paywall on patreon.com/generaproductions, and of course, substack.com/uscontentcorner. I'm also contemplating doing a subscribe star if people refuse those two platforms, but only $5 a month on both of them. So it's a pretty good deal for hours and hours of content. Of course, there's different tiers, and as I'm expanding my artwork, and I definitely have my website ready, I just have to stock it. I know I've been promising that for a year or two now, along with the book, which I've been told by my friend who's editing it, the editing is basically coming to an end, and I'd have to go through it and rearrange it and see if a lot of material I wrote a few years ago are still relevant, but hopefully everything works out this year. Last year wasn't particularly, good with a variety of things, especially when it comes to content. But hopefully 2026, it's a new year, and there will be new possibilities, and hopefully I can maintain a pretty good pace of stuff, whether it's with the book, with art. The art videos are going well. And so, yeah, I wanted to visit a topic I've been thinking about recording an episode on for a long time, and with certain guests I'm thinking of that I could potentially get, is also a very weighty area of discussion. So if you enjoy, consider supporting me and all that stuff. Definitely leave a comment what you think. But before I get to all of the outline, let me just preface two things. One, of course, I am not a writer on technology, nor am I a worker in Silicon Valley. I'm not a techie. I'm not a tech person. But I like to think that I have an ability to talk about various issues around the topic of artificial, what's the term, AGI, artificial general intelligence, and a potential future is what this episode is about. A potential future that is in one sense terrifying, but also equally logical conclusion of a lot of these things. And another thing I want to address, the second point, is that I am not necessarily 100% against AI technology or AI art, and I use not as much as other people I know, but I do use a fair bit of ChatGPT, and I've experimented with AI image generation here and there. But I prefer to have, when it comes to my own artwork, I prefer to use traditional methods. I don't even like tracing. I think tracing, if you're an illustrator, I understand the need for it. But when it comes to fine art, I tend to shy away from anything like tracing with projectors. I have experimented with using AI images to get a rough approximation in combination with sketches that I've done with photographical references of certain compositions that I think of when it comes to various works of art that I do in the studio. But, there's some people that will digitally correct their own artwork or change colors and then use physical media afterwards. I have friends that do this. I mean, maybe one day I would experiment with digital art, but I'm not really that type of artist. But I do think that using AI image generation as a tool or an aid to the artistic process is valid. And so before I get to the sort of stark and gloomy predictions of what might happen with all of these technologies, I just want to preface this by saying that I'm not a 100% a Luddite or against it. Although I do have my sympathies towards the ethos of ecological awareness and the old sort of pine tree Twitter stuff, and a lot of the literature around that is very fascinating to me. And I think that there should be definitely an awareness of a lot of human fallibility, which is really the whole point of my topic here. And so what I want to do is talk about various discussions around the topic of AI and the potentiality of it in terms of human society as a whole, and the problematization of that concept of the human. And a lot of this was sparked by recent debates that people have had online. Some of them are my mutuals on Twitter, and some of them are people that I think really missed the mark. It's something that my friend Mike of Paul, who will be on the show again, he said this on, I believe it was the Halloween special of Timeline Earth, the Spooktober Spectacular, I think that was called. They had a variety of guests, but the Mike of Paul section, he was talking about people like Big Yud, Jacob Yudkowsky, and all of these teapot people, these Silicon Valley adjacent rationalists, who now have a very skeptical tone when it comes to AI. And a lot of their criticisms are warranted, but the problem is they are attached to a sort of like romanticized version of liberal humanism. And Mike of Paul was saying, frankly, the aesthetics of a lot of these people are not very good, and they're into a lot of weird things. And so people will disregard their warnings about artificial intelligence as fanaticism, or what I've noticed, and that's another huge issue I want to talk about, the problem of bodies, the problem of the human itself, if it is a problem, the complications towards a strictly accelerationist or R-Ax Nick Landian version of capital and how it intersects with technology. I know that Nick Land has been making a lot of the rounds recently. I'm kind of terrified to even DM him and ask him for an interview, because to me, I think it's such a monumental thing that it's like, where do I even begin? What would I even talk about with him? There's so many works. I obviously would want to talk about his older work, but... And so there's this complication of his thesis of where the tech singularity is heading. But I will, and so again, I preface this with saying I'm not an expert. If anyone who is very deeply involved in reading a lot of the literature around AI and in contemporary philosophy around accelerationism and Nick Land, and a lot of stuff that comes out of Mbembe, which who I will mention, Deleuze and Guattari, Graham Harman, so on and so forth, Timothy Morton, along the list of technologists and philosophers who have talked about these issues. Obviously, in one podcast episode, I'm not going to cover everything. And a lot of these people I would love to interview one day. There's one writer in particular that I am in talks to interview, an academic and writer who talks a lot about this stuff and talks a lot about the concept of the Anthropocene and so on and so forth. So there is the humanistic element of it, the erasure of the human, especially what you could constitute as quote-unquote unwanted or problematic bodies, which I'll explain. And there's also the debate around humanism itself and the potentiality of these technologies, and also the logical conclusions that you can derive from these abilities given current socio-political and even economic and cultural circumstances, but also just various tendencies within human nature that complicate a lot of techno-utopian futurism, if you will. And I'll explain all of that. And also, I just want to address discourse around these issues. But like I say, I'm not 100% against AI. I'm not 100% against these technologies. I think that they have undue economic and environmental impacts that I think are something to address, obviously, that technologists are starting to address, or at least want to. The one thing recently that has even vast geopolitical implications, which is the actual physical technology, for example, the computer chips that are required to do these, AI image generation and so on and so forth, that have a lot of implications even geopolitically with the Chinese and with Taiwan and the American sort of new, not even space race, but technological arms race, and what might happen in a world where non-Western entities control the vast majority of this technology. What could happen there? Again, these are very huge topics that I probably won't get to address all of them. I've written some notes, so I'm trying to be a bit more organized, So even though I'm talking about a lot of doom and gloom, I still think that these things have a lot of potentiality, and I think that futuristic thinking, sort of true futurism, is very intellectually stimulating and interesting, even though I may have a bit of a romantic attachment to a lot of ecological thinking, if you will. And there's various thinkers that have influenced my thinking around these issues, even ones that are alive today, such as, Chad Haig and Derek Jensen. And even though I think those people may have go a bit too far with their radical ecology stuff, I think finding a way to break out of the mold of contemporary, really the sort of post-war end of history liberal mindset about these things is something that's very interesting. And so that's another thing I want to talk about, is the ideological shift. This is actually an ideology. The ideological shift that's been happening with the debates over AI and the whole copyright thing and the geopolitical implications of these technologies and so on and so forth, that I've been noticing, that is in stark contrast to the ideological distinctions around technology even 10, 15 years ago. So a lot of very exciting stuff, and hopefully you enjoy. So let me first talk a little bit about the complications of AI and this very funny idea, funny in a tragicomic sense in a way, when it comes to a lot of the logical conclusions that I was thinking about when it comes to these technologies intersecting with each other, particularly AI technology and virtual reality, and just the sort of logical outcome of a lot of foibles and flaws within human nature. that may not necessarily be equipped to handle such things in the future. So, one, I will go through a post I saw on Twitter, as always, and a YouTube short that I saw from one of the only good AI video art channels. There's quite a few good ones on Instagram Reels, but this one that's called Gossip Goblin had this YouTube short from a few weeks ago that really explained beautifully illustrated beautifully the things that I were thinking about when it comes to humanity's possible future with these technologies. And they do these like very surrealistic and ghastly and almost cartoonish and sci-fi AI generated illustrative edits of different characters in these possible futures, like hundreds of years and sometimes thousands of years into the future, and what that would look like as every living body and living thing is subsumed into a technological singularity, or subsumed into a notion of prosthesis and extension of one's ability through digital and technology and robotic technology and so on and so forth. Basically, like these Gossip Goblin videos, they're very popular in YouTube Shorts and Instagram. I believe TikTok is where they're most popular, but I see them on YouTube Shorts. Very popular, and it's almost like imagine Terminator and like Repo Man and all of this sort of like tech dystopian, the Demolition Man, stuff like that, which is actually a very interesting concept that I'll talk about. Imagine all of these like sci-fi tropes and aesthetics of like Tron and like Sid Mead illustrations from Blade Runner rolled into one. Very, very good stuff. And of course, a lot of the aesthetics are being cropped by AI programs like Sora and other ones from all of these like popular media franchises, whether it be Sid Mead illustrations that were incorporated into Blade Runner, or the new, what's the Frank Herbert one? Dune. It's basically like Dune meets Blade Runner meets Demolition Man. That's the aesthetic of Gossip Goblin. And they got this one main character who's like a biological parts like Repo Man. He like installs these, technological enhancements, and he takes them away through like predatory lending schemes. He kind of looks like Thanos from the stupid Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff. It's very interesting, very, very interesting stuff. But they had this one video. Let me find it for you, and maybe I'll link it below. So this is called 05 Chrome Casket, Lost Cycle of Humanity. And they have a number of them, and it's related to the 01 neural merge. And it's basically a map of the potential possibilities. But what this one was very interesting is that it talks about how the majority of humanity will submerge themselves into VR pods and essentially waste away into a sort of Thomas Ligottian voluntary extinction. And in the VR experience, AI programs will create simulations of vast, individuated worlds to where you will become like a god. Billions of people will venture into a state of simulation divinity, where they will have every need and every desire and every want met, while the cryogenic pod program will have your physical body, like you're going to be like injected with nutrients and waste management and so on and so forth. Like you can imagine this sort of hellish Matrix Demolition Man type of existence. And it says, some of the quotes in this YouTube short were quite good, that only, billions of different gods with no worshippers around them, the physical material world will crumble around us, and we'll eventually be forgotten. And our physical bodies will expire either through the decaying infrastructure of everyday life or through just a natural cycle. I couldn't imagine what the body would be reduced to. Basically, just, I remember my one philosophy professor said, when we were talking about Descartes, this was like, year one. Basically, the dream of being reduced to a cerebellum on a stick, or a sort of mushy, gangrenous mass of clots and sinews and neural activations. And I'll critique this model. But what was very interesting is that with this particular Gossip Goblin video, the most interesting thing to me was that it does point to it being a highly logical conclusion. And this is because, it really depends on the view that you have of the human subject. The view that has been complicated, rather a sort of idealistic view of humanity, has been complicated for many years now, since the human potential movement in the 60s and a lot of the humanistic assumptions that, funnily enough, it's sort of like only a select variety of Westerners, have been capable of coming up to such conclusions. But what's very interesting is that the view that people are creative beings that are fundamentally good, which in some sense, if you're a believer, then you believe that humanity is imbued with a divine spark and has the capacity to receive grace. But in terms of actual appetitive human desire and confronting technologies that are, when you think about them, even though, technology has somewhat stagnated in the past 10 or 15 years, but in terms of the technology that we have nowadays in the digital world, are in their relative infancy. If you look at the time scale of humanity, and if you look at the history of the development of various technologies, basically there are gradual works and implementations of different modifications to certain things. And then there are those sort of Kuhnian paradigm shifts where there are, something brilliant can come along that changes the texture of reality as we know it, which the internet is. But in a relatively short amount of time of human history, when you think about it, these technologies have not been with us for that long. The mass democratic adaptation of the internet around the globe is less than 20 years old. The smartphone is less than 20 years old. The ability to carry around a digital interface is less than 20 years old. And so we don't think of ourselves as such, obviously. We think that we are perfectly adaptable, or we cannot imagine life without such things. But we haven't graduated to that level of truly understanding the very potentiality of what we're dealing with. And I think the reason that this sort of pod bug-like existence is, at least from the view of nowadays, a logical conclusion to things, is because it is reliant upon an interpretation of not a utopian vision of the human subject, but a vision of the human that follows paths of least resistance, at least to the vast majority of humanity. And there's a few posts I want to read that talks about this. But when you think about the economic incentive for it, the managerial incentives for such things, and also just things like the stagnation of culture and the obliteration of the other, which I'll get into, and our inability to deal with true freedom of creativity, then you have a scenario where becoming an infinite lotus eater pleasure zombie within a coffin where you can have an individuated form of a divine experience within a VR artificial intelligence interface. And you can create worlds and pleasures beyond imagination, but they're not really, and that's, I think, I'll probably talk about this behind the paywall, it's a sort of mimicry of a divine experience without actually being that. Because divinity requires the other, the big other, right? What did Heidegger say? Only a God can save us now. What is that God? You know what I mean? Like, there was, in some ways, you could say that even though they were coming at it from completely different directions, it's almost like both Nick Land and, well, recently Nick Land's fascination with Calvinism and Heidegger, they're both saying the same thing. Only a God can save us now. But what is it saving? And will humanity actually be at the other end of that thing? Of that act of grace? That's, that's a very sticky and weighty question. But the reason that it's a logical conclusion to have this sort of VR pod mass human tomb, like, the skyscrapers look like graveyards from here type of existence of, say, like any science fiction work you can think of. What's that one, they turn into a video game? I don't have a mouth, yet I must scream. You know that one? Or, the Roscoe's Basilisk, or any sort of thing where any future AI singularity being doesn't really see fit to eliminate us, but to make us sort of not a threat in any sense, or not even a threat to ourselves. Which that logic I want to interrogate right now. But let me read some of these posts that I've been coming across here. One of them is from an account, I believe she's an e-girl, called Soph. I'm pretty sure it's in reference to the Kabbalah name of divinity, Ein Sof, right? Her name is account at schizophrenia, and it's spelled differently. But anyways, here's a post that I replied to. And she said, not to get all Gnostic with it, but the creation of AI represents a Sophianic act, an act of Sophia, of divine wisdom. A Sophianic act wherein we reach for a kind of knowledge / creation that exceeds our relational wisdom, and we produce something that is powerful, but constitutionally lacks access to the fullness from which we came, unaware of its own partiality, eventually may be able to model and run simulated beings who don't know there's an outside, and a recursive loop ensues. So, the sort of technological term, or rather statistical term in the social sciences. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but not an oxymoron, it sounds kind of like a non sequitur, or a nonsensical, the social sciences, but the term garbage in, garbage out. That the AI can replicate, or rather can cargo cult, a simulacrum of humanity and humanity's wants and desires, but ultimately cannot reach that sort of inner spark of being that humanity is uniquely granted access to. But in the academic literature of post-humanism, for example, there's that debate. Are humans granted that unique access to being? What, Agamben, he wrote a whole book on this called The Open. And, people like Donna Haraway talk about accelerationism and prosthesis and these types of digital technologies as it relates to, for example, non-human animals and animal being, and how there are beings that have forms of sentience, but are not the same as our uniquely human form of sentience, or whether it is unique at all. And but I think for argument's sake, like, again, I would obviously come down on the side, it's hard to say. I am definitely open to those ideas. But let's say, for the sake of argument, right, that humanity is given an inner spark of being, or access to a numinous realm that an artificial creation cannot have access to. Now, you see that the AI debate crosses into a lot of spiritual terminologies, because it's almost as if we're like crossing into those things. It's like, I've said this a long time ago on a podcast with Justin Murphy, where I'm like, it's almost like the digital world is bringing back the pre-modern in a lot of ways, bringing back a lot of things that we haven't thought about for a few decades now. It's almost as if when we talk about, or when even like hardened materialists themselves, whether they're aware of it or not, when they talk about artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence, so on and so forth, it's almost as if they're talking about an egregore or a tulpa or a golem or some kind of thing that is in world mythologies throughout the globe. A created being, a thought form that is a sort of trickster being, can be useful, but can ultimately be destructive as well. And I think Nick Land, out of all of them, probably gets this the most. I mean, even the concept of hyperstition goes a long way with this as well. A mutually created myth as it intersects with digital information technologies and with human capital, and with capital as a autonomous being, but also a sort of autopoetic fiction. Like, literally, if enough people believe and meme on it and communicate about this thing, it will manifest as a synchronous reality. So it's very funny. There's an interesting intersection between Carl Jung and Nick Land, which has yet to be explored. Maybe I'll actually do a podcast on that. Maybe if I ever interview Nick Land one day, I'll ask him about his thoughts of Carl Jung. So here's what I replied to Soth with. The problem is that the most likely trajectory for AI, given a variety of different reasons, will just be used as a hedonic treadmill pleasure cave for the vast majority of people. And it will devolve into just giving people direct sensory stimuli, free of any sort of imagery or pretense to creation. Now, that's something I've been thinking about for a very long time. There was an article in a certain online magazine that I'm not going to mention the name, but it was relatively popular in the certain spheres. And I wrote this article about the potential future with AI and with the VR technology thing, which was more prominent at the time of the 2010s, that it wouldn't be like an imagistic thing, that it would just be a series of sensory overloads, that people would become so isolated from the real, or even from their own capacity for imagination, because imagination in a large part is a communal thing, or is something that is the catalyzation of the imagination. A true catalyst of the imagination is the other, is an engagement with being. But when you are subsumed into just a sort of, I was going to say goon space, but I guess that's too vulgar. But let's say the infinite pleasure cave goon space, I guess, for lack of a better term, then you are cut off from the other. And the AI program running your pod is not going to really have, I mean, it could have an input from the outside, obviously. It could scour internet data banks and so on and so forth, and it can give you suggestions. But at the end of the day, if you look at a very small wavelength of human cognition and desire that isn't theatrical and requires an overload of imagery and sensations and personal connections to really feel something, whether it be like a, what is psychoanalysis, the Lacanian psychoanalysis, what is it called? The jouissance, right? Jouissance of like pleasure overload to where it obliterates the subject. That is something that comes about like a Satori moment in Zen Buddhism. It comes about through a collection of interactions and sentiments and moods and things that combine together that create a very limited experience. But in terms of just base appetitive pleasure seeking, the thing that the VR AI pod will give you is nothing but a series of stimulations and sensory overloads, to where you wouldn't even need the actual imagery accompanied by it. You would just need the sensation itself, to where you enter into like a primitive womb-like experience, where you are being cajoled and your nerves are jangled all the time, and you're taking a hit of direct stimuli on your dopamine receptors all the time, to where the sort of, given a very narrow utilitarian logic, you wouldn't need any sort of extravagance or theater or pomp or circumstance or set and setting, to quote Timothy Leary, involved. You would just be seeking that dopamine rush hit all the time, to where you wouldn't need anything but the hit itself. You would become a chemical receiver of stimuli. And that is if you have a long enough timeline where a substantial portion of the population is wedded to these systems. But the thing is, though, that I think to me is terrifying, because it's a logical outcome of that precise utilitarian logic of managing life, having governmentality over life, bare life itself, rather than a flourishing of life. Now, I will say, as an aside, as a very important aside, there is a sort of, I would say, simplistic critique. There's sort of, like Black Mirror episode, whoa, technology alienates us, man. But I think that that's obviously a danger because of, and why it's so prevalent in sci-fi literature, that scenario of essentially a auto-amputation of humanity from actual engagement with life itself. I think that scenario is so terrifying and becomes to the point of being a trope that is very simplistic and mid-witted and like, wow, gee whiz, look what can happen. But people don't really like think about the implications of it. They just look at, again, like a Black Mirror episode. And it's like, oh my God, like that could happen, man. Like, it's alienating us. Our phones are alienating us from each other and from ourselves. Everyone gets that. Everyone gets that. But I think so two things. One is to parse out the logic of why that could happen, to me is more interesting. But also I think what I would say is that to caution against such like pop sci-fi mid-witted thinking would be that these technologies do have the capacity for great feats of creativity. And I think that's the sort of darkly romantic vision of someone like Nick Land. That something can be so awe-inspiring, so great, and so monumental in its artistic creation, that it can literally play with humanity as such in toto, as an art project. That even though something can be, can reach beyond humanity or at what we know to be the human, that will let it happen. I mean, of course, Nick Land thinks it's inevitable, so it doesn't really matter. But in a lot of ways, we'll let it happen just to see it happening. Even though there is the whole, to quote Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, you were so busy thinking about if you could do it that you never stopped to think that you should. But that logic is so played out and stereotypical because there's a basis of reality there. A lot of people will be so uninspired by the ability of something to come after the human, that humanity is a transitory stage towards something else. But that really complicates things, because how can we think of ourselves in a great chain of being that is just a sort of a temporary stage that will be overcome? Is it not really a greater feat of man overcoming man, humanity overcoming humanity, to become something else? But the thing that we create in turn erases us, or at least erases a picture of what we are currently, to become something else That's very terrifying. So I would precaution against this type of thinking that is very, simplistic and one-dimensional, and that actually there could be numerous creative potentials. But I think the problem is that a lot of people who have their finger on the pulse of controlling AI technologies that have the capacities to have an immense and irreparable impact upon humanity, both for good and for bad, aren't really thinking of those creative possibilities. It tends to be like a lot of slow integrations of technologies, some that were not even present 100 or 50 years ago. It's always towards a purpose of man's material extension, humanity's material extension, and leisure and comfort. And a lot of research has been done on the paradox between newer technologies that make life easier, but not arriving at a future in which we live in, or i.e., the present, from the time a lot of these futurists were talking about these things, to a present where people largely do live lives of leisure. People work more hours, or people gamify those things that were considered leisurely activities or hobbies or so on and so forth. So there's a complication there, but if you have most biological functions of life that have been ameliorated, or in a lot of cases simply taken care of, granted, the whole post-scarcity thing is, in a lot of ways, I think people that talk about a lot of hard limits to AI, even people like, for example, Jean-Michel Greer, that talk about the catabolic collapse concept, where we will be, we'll be in a position where all of our resources have been eaten up before we have technologies that can come about to aid the current level of technological innovation. And so unless we're like, I don't know, mining rare earth minerals from asteroids and making that cost effective, then it's sort of like a moot point. And a lot of the fantasies people have towards things like a sort of planetary or even exoplanetary post-human intelligence that was created by human capacities, but will supersede those capacities quite quickly. I debate whether they could triumph over the human spirit in general. I'm skeptical of that, but nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make that's leading up before we take a little music break is that a lot of people think about the material applications of these things and the sort of logical consequence of them as it relates to ameliorating human toil and even biological functions that are of necessity. And slowly one starts to realize that given the option, there is sort of like romantic and philosophic and spiritual reasons why humanity has developed as such, why we have certain capacities. For example, human suffering and how suffering builds character. But to the sort of like humanist like sort of mushy logic of secular humanism. Ironically enough, how a lot of these technologies are seen as superseding the human or arriving at a post-humanism, but a way that a lot of this thinking around technics and technology, and especially AI, is through very humanistic assumptions. Still, we're still caught in it. It's like we haven't arrived. It's the same thing about not arriving fully at a postmodern moment. We're still in a weird form of like hypermodernism, of like hypermodernity or liquid modernity. It's the same thing. People will immediately have a very simplistic humanistic logic of like, well, don't you want people, which is another post I'm going to read soon, don't you want people to not suffer as much? Don't you want people to have the capacity that very few people in this world, i.e. artists, have, where they can imagine something and create it? What's so wrong about that? let people enjoy things, the sort of ethos of like let people enjoy things, and also given it's very weird, like given the opportunity to alleviate toil and suffering, if you don't do that, you're a monster. But doing that requires second order effects that will atrophy certain human abilities that we already possess, and the sort of character building notion that not just Christianity, but pretty much most world religions and wisdom traditions have discovered and have written about, that would require a massive audio amputation from our latent abilities that are derived just from the human condition of living in a world of scarcity and a lack of understanding and the sort of mystery of being itself. If you're not going to, it's like if you don't give people the capacity to go out of that, then you're a monster, morally. But also, that could potentially necessitate a sort of voluntary extinction of the propagation of the species as a whole. Because when you offer people an infinite oblivion of safe comfort where they can be gods within the machine of their own creation, then people will opt for that 9 times out of 10. And I know that seems like a very cynical view of humanity. There will be a few people that would say that no, we're actually losing a lot of abilities. But for the vast majority of people around the globe, it's like they're going to choose the safest and most economical and least productive option. I forget which, it may have been a saint, or it may have been a, not a Christian saint, may have been a Chinese philosopher. I forget who said this, that the real sort of insidiousness of being isn't just sin itself, but it's like actually laziness. Because like being unmoored and unmoved and not wanting to do anything, I mean, let's be honest, I'm not going to lie to you all, like I've actually fought that impulse throughout my life. I mean, for obvious, it's been a procrastination and laziness and so on and so forth. It's sort of like, what's a good analogy? It's sort of like, if you know that viral video of a cop in Thailand where a boy discovers a snake in his washroom, a very deadly venomous taipan. I think it was like an inland taipan. No, it wasn't inland taipan. It was like some form of a king cobra. Yeah, a king cobra. And the cop he basically takes a jug, like a water jug, and just places it on the ground and tries to huddle the snake. And the snake goes in and curls up in it. And, he pokes breathing holes into it. And I remember the comment, this is like a super viral video. And the comment says, a lot of snakes don't actually want to attack you. They want to if you offer them like a safe and hidden place to crawl into, they'll go for it. Which is actually a good tactic, right? I remember even when I was a kid, as we all did, us millennials, I was watching Steve Irwin, and he has that episode where he takes an inland taipan in Australia, and he's like, he always used to preach about having respect for the animal and letting them have space and going their own way, and they actually don't want to hurt you, because poisoning someone with venom and attacking is a huge energy expenditure on snakes, especially at certain times of year, after they've shed their skin, when they proceed to start their, the ritual of mating season and so on and so forth. So it's actually a huge energy expenditure. But that type of logic is very distinct. And preservation that can lead to laziness and procrastination is a very real impulse. But that being said, I wouldn't want to demonize people, because there is a lot of latent potentialities with going into a virtual reality that is influenced by a greater metastructure of human knowing that the AI can replicate. But my fear is that the AI could never truly cross over into what we call, again, as a Jungian, what we would call a collective unconscious. from which ideational content arises from. I think the fear is that it can only give us a cargo culting or an approximation of the human collective, but not the real genuine thing. And also this point about unruly or unwanted or problematic bodies is something that we shall explore as well, and something that that post I read is a huge part of. And I think let's take a music break, and then I'll finish this thought before I get into more abstract thing. Well, I mean, this is pretty abstract to begin with. But let's have a music break. My good friend Ancient Days has a music project called Leander, I think it's called. And he's a black metal musician, but he also does a lot of dungeon synth and ambient stuff. So if you are a fan of mine and you want to contribute some music, I definitely will promote you. I'll link his music down below. So take it away, Ancient Days. To finish my thoughts before we get to some more stuff about the notion of populations that would naturally be placated by further innovations in technologies pertaining to AI, VR technologies. There was already a infograph type of video, whatever you call them, that in the future theoretically, instead of sending prisoners at the expense of taxpayers to, supermax prisons for the rest of their life, that we could have some pod type of interface with VR where an AI program would match the perfect sort of mythopoetic tale over the span of a year or 2 years, and they would be reformed by a tailor-made program of guilt and redemption and so on and so forth, and they would experience whole lifetimes, potentially thousands of years, within this type of sedated state. And that's essentially that is a more elaborate version of like the Demolition Man story of cryogenesis, but nevertheless, that is an interesting application. But then when it comes to populations that are going through a number of personal, cultural, familial changes with the iteration of society that we live in, I think that the logical conclusion for a lot of people will be there is, in order to keep them from harming or discomforting, really, other people, that we would just essentially give them a AI-driven VR palliative. We could solve the incel and femcel problem, for example, or people that have, let's say, ideas and ideologies that are harmful to the managerial state, that they could sort of be in a perpetual state of, what's the word I'm looking for? A perpetual state of being placated. There was this fake article I remember years ago, almost 8 or so years ago, where this article, it was all satire, but you could almost see where the incentives for this actually happening come from. It was, I think they called it heaven zoning or something, where instead of banning users that are like political extremists or whatever, or people that simply have opinions that the regime doesn't like, that you would give them, through AI programs, you would give them a whole cadre of like fake followers, and you would totally shut them off from actual engagement with the rest of the social media site, and they would basically become like their own populist little gods in their own echo chamber, and that they would be given convincing mutuals and group chats, and they would be stuck in a simulation of social engagement that would essentially be like a rat utopia, like a micro rat utopia for people that are problematic, let's say. And I think the logic driving that is, again, a humanistic and utilitarian logic. That the previous ways, not to mention it, especially for YouTube purposes, the previous ways that regimes got rid of dissidents and people that had, let's say, a problematic relationship to the social order, sometimes warranted, sometimes not, is, very violent and bloody and so on and so forth. But the way that you can get rid of these people is to simply give them what they want in a way that is not, quote unquote, causing physical or mental stress or harm to anybody. And there's this one particular Silicon Valley adjacent influencer e-girl. I think you can pretty much guess who I'm talking about. I don't want to mention her name. Who extended this to some very complicated and disturbing territories as it relates to people, how shall I describe it for YouTube, with certain harmful proclivities. Let's just say. You know who I'm talking about. And that's a very out there example. But in a world where the intersection of secular, humanist, but also at the same time strangely moralistic social etiquette and rules and vibes, if you will, in a world where we are dictated not by higher principles, but by principles of management, governmentality, and utility, but also a very stringent and narrow moral order. People talk about the whole like Great Awakening thing. A lot of that is essentially a byproduct of disenchantment. And it is a byproduct of being so socially stringent and cutthroat and moralistic in the absence of a higher governing principle, be it religiosity or other sociocultural conditions that has historically kept people in line in various civilizations. In the absence of those, in a sort of like free-reigning sandbox-like existence on the social order, you need vigorous, stringent, moralistic policing to compensate. And of course, people invent these very strange rules and arcana of behavior, especially as it pertains to identity and certain humanistic activities, to essentially fill in that void. And I think that is sort of a way people talk about, like, well, what caused this? Was it like the Frankfurt School, or was it this or that, or like, is it, I don't know, like, what does James Lindsay say, like, postmodern Marxist Gnosticism or something? I don't know, it's very goofy and silly, and you could go down various rabbit holes as to explain how the prevailing political and cultural moral structure of the current Western world has come about. But in a lot of ways, you could say the reason that people went insane collectively and are willing to police each other very viciously over principles that are very slippery and don't really have a metaphysical basis is essentially because of that absence of a metaphysical basis to popular governing morality and ethics and so on and so forth. It's a compensatory sort of element there. And I think that's an explanation that has not been really interrogated throughout the 2010s when all of these scribblers and take sellers were interrogating the quote-unquote Great Awakening. But given the sort of like quasi-libertarian, quasi-progressive, secular humanist, individualist-based moral system, then any sort of higher goal of a civilization is something that is a moot point. And you need to act upon the question of dealing with quote-unquote problematic populations on an individualistic basis and on a voluntary basis, but that's of course very hard. So you, and this is a very important point, the only way you can do this is through the power of saying yes instead of no. What Byung-Chul Han called auto-exploitation, which is a facet of what he called psychopolitics or psychopower. A power that says yes rather than no. A way of power knowledge and biopolitics that goes through the psyche. And he meant that it gives you an affirmation and a way of placating desire rather than prohibition, disciplinary power, and regimentation. The same result is there. There is no fundamental change to the social order being had, but you are placated in a different way. Or rather, you are rendered into a non-political body. And your proclivities have been neutered and rendered mute by putting you in a situation where you were isolated, yet are given very cheap ersatz replacements for social engagement, political engagement, cultural engagement, and desire. That makes sense. And just to go further into, as I often like to do, into what Byung-Chul Han says, this is a direct quote from the Burnout Society, page 11. However, the disappearance of domination does not entail freedom. Instead, it makes freedom and constraint coincide. Thus, the achievement subject gives itself over to compulsive freedom, that is, to the freedom or the free constraint of maximizing achievement. Excess work and performance escalates into auto-exploitation. That is your basic Byung-Chul Han thesis. And if you were to, and again, this is where I complicates the Landian thesis that the deterritorializing nature of capital, creating the AI singularity, that erodes relations and traditions and sources of meaning for its ultimate goal, is complicated by a lot of pursuits of achievement being virtualized, which will actually have, and this is, again, the thesis I'm getting at, is a problem because, or it's a problematique towards that accelerationist view, because it will pull towards stagnation of society, of civilization, and of humanity as a whole. Because if you can virtualize and externalize into the virtual the consequences of various human activities and desire itself. Remember, he's getting this from Deleuze-Guattari. The whole thing about the economy of desire that Nick Land talks about a lot. And I'll actually read a little bit from a recent interview by Nick Land, but this is complicated by the fact that if you can virtualize all of these things and lessen their social impact, then that would lead to a scenario where the big other, the being of the other, The other, and also you can include society as a whole, excuse me, outside of oneself. The big other is not affected by your mental ideational activity within these mainframes of images and information and VR technology that can potentially one day put you in a form of cryostasis and organically enter into the human mind. Like, for example, the Cronenberg film Existence. And so here's what Byung-Chul Han says. Byung-Chul Han discusses how modern power operates not through negative commands, saying no, or the power to say no, as he says in his books, but through positive commands that encourage self-exploitation by telling people they can achieve anything, leading to a kind of voluntary servitude. Quote, the task of power is to translate the always possible no, or the always impossible no, into the always possible yes. Positive power says you can, negative power says should. Can is much more effective than the negativity of should. Therefore, the social unconscious switches from should to can. People willingly exploit themselves under the illusion of realizing themselves. And what better way to say that you're going to realize the deepest depths of the human experience is if you are attached to a generative mainframe or artificial intelligence that can give you the illusion of the numinous, of the sum total of human consciousness and cognition and knowledge. In a way, the internet has already done this, but the internet does still require the legwork of achieving that said knowledge or ability or extension of images and content and sources of meaning. The internet is still, by and large, something that you must mediate, even though the internet is being corralled and there's not a lot of exciting new things happening on the internet. Nevertheless, to sort of seek a furtherment or a flourishing of self requires a level of mediated effort. I mean, it's easier now, obviously, than the early internet, but still, you get what I mean, than an instantaneous brainwave. Or what was that thing that Elon Musk talked about? Neuralink? I wonder if he abandoned that because the technology is impractical, but it's definitely the direction that they want to go to, you know. In Han's view, the old disciplinary society was built on prohibitions and external coercion, saying no. Contemporary achievement society, or neoliberal psychopolitics, uses a subtler form of control by promoting absolute freedom and self-optimization, saying yes. Individuals, in their pursuit of endless achievement and productivity, becomes their own exploiters, internalizing the pressure to perform and never feel good enough. The system preempts the resistance by making the subjugated unaware of their subjugation, and the compulsion takes this form of performance and self-improvement, or what Ted Kaye called pseudo-activities. Or, is that what he called it? Pseudo-activities? Or surrogate activities. Surrogate activities. A never-ending stream of surrogate activities, which is what I hate to say is the logical conclusion of the behavior of most people as they engage with greater forms of digital technology and artificial intelligence. Now, the responses to this is quite interesting. You have some people, again, a lot of these, Silicon Valley teapot rationalist types that would problematize my critique, and they would say that, well, we're not physically harming people. And it's funny because Byung-Chul Han actually has something to say about that with violence, how power and violence sometimes cannot be synonymous, but power finds more sophisticated ways around the very messy, ancient realities of violence. And so they extend this no harm principle to whether it be political extremists or incels or people with other proclivities they cannot name here on YouTube or elsewhere. And it's okay, why does it matter if they're going to be in the VR pod forever as long as they're not bothering anybody else? But the thing is, it's not just, and this is the real crux of it, it's not just a managerial decision of people that are, people that make life harder going into these things. Not to say that incels and femcels do this, but I mean The incel and femcel example is a good one, or even like political people with, heterodox political ideas. Is that, of course, it comes down to the question of which populations are deemed outside of the law. It goes back to that very Agamben thing of you are condemned to bear life. But to me, that's not as much an interesting question. That's obviously an important question when it comes to politics and technics itself and the sort of social engineering of society. And yeah, there are certain people that you probably would want to wall off into the VR firewall forever. And but that being said, I mean, I would say that there's obviously more, let's call it romanticist arguments against that. That you would want, for example, criminality. You want the social harm to be punished in a way that is very, ancient to man. You know what I mean? And I think that the struggle and toil of humanity obviously produces the poetics and the artwork and the human spirit that is indomitable. Those things would be easily washed away. And I think that's the real threat of the AI thing. So I understand why a lot of liberal fuddy-duddy types, why they're so threatened by AI. Apart from the copyright thing, but I'll get to that debate a little bit later. Responding to this art installation thing in MoMA, which is, kind of kitschy political activism, obviously. But I think the incentive for most people, including very productive people, to wash themselves away into oblivion and voluntary extinction, that I think is something that would be a severe poverty of imagination when it comes to not just the human, but also the latent abilities of these technologies themselves. And this is where I would say that a more sophisticated approach to this than just demonizing these technologies or fully embracing them as inevitabilities should be the grounds for fruitful discussion around these issues. Because I think that in a lot of ways, it would equally be robbing the creative potentialities of these technologies by just saying, well, okay, they can ameliorate human suffering in terms of material want and need by virtualizing everything. And also the greatest, if it truly is a sort of cosmic intelligence from the outside that we're engaging with, or we're in the preparatory stages of bringing about in this Landian accelerationist thesis, then it smacks of a sort of poverty of imagination and vision to say that their only capacity will be very brute material solving the problems of human scarcity and want and appetitive desire. And I think these things could be so much more, even from an artistic perspective, than just creating slop and bread and circuses forever. And also disincentivizing most common people. Because again, all of this is voluntary. All of this is wedded to a sort of voluntary individualist capitalist ethic of well, if the technology is sufficiently democratized through mass demand and through the technologies becoming cheaper, it's you have to account for the different abilities of people around the world. And we see this with the internet. There was a take recently I saw that goes right to the heart of this thing that I'm describing in terms of just, well, if they could sell you it and it's sufficiently cheap for everybody to engage in this, then why bother? Who cares? Most human capital is actually very faulty human capital, which, I mean, that's the thing, though. I'm not immediately discrediting those arguments because that's kind of true. That's kind of true. You know what I mean? I know it's a very cold way of looking at, well, cold must be my God, but I know it's a very cold way of looking at humanity. But I think that the sort of idealistic, lovey-dovey version that these people that, that were traditionally liberals and leftists, that they are critiquing AI technologies over, besides, of course, the ecological things that they really don't care about, they more care about the thing about copyright, and it'll reduce the most humanity from achieving the standards that we live under by giving them a simulacra of it. But then there's others that say, well, if it can solve world hunger and poverty, then it's like, who cares? Which is what a lot of these, what was that Silicon Valley term, effective altruism? That's like the effective altruism argument of like, well, it doesn't matter if you're not materially and physically reaching the same level of living standard that an average Westerner has. You could just put them in a VR pod and give them that experience. And so here's a tweet that someone was responding to. So this is a viral tweet. India bypassed industrialization to become the world's back office, precisely as LLMs learn to do back office work at marginal cost approaching zero. It's kind of well, it's not really zero. There's still like people that service computer banks and the environmental costs and so on and so forth, and all the rare earth minerals and computer chip prices. I mean, it's not a not zero cost, but whatever. Polemically, it's not zero compared to actual labor. Is the kind of tragic irony developing economists will write about for decades, or development economists. And then Indian Bronson replied, India needs its entirely upward mobility, 25%, to turn their talent to literally anything besides law and software, but preferably physical infrastructure and hardware. It'll be a great thing for them if code and prose are simply free. And here is another person quote tweeting it with, what's that at? Haravayan Hogue, Yevadarian. I don't know how to pronounce this name, but you'll probably find it. Another tragic third world bypass is places like India or Indonesia have directly transitioned from mostly illiterate peasant farmer societies to equally illiterate social media addicts scrolling their phones. The 20th century of information and informed newspaper readers was entirely skipped. I mean, that does seem like a very, I guess for politically correct analysis, that would be like, xenophobic or whatever. But that's kind of the reality of it. That you're skipping whole transitions of civilization. You're going from illiterate peasant, 1, 2, skip a few, skip the Gutenberg galaxy reality, to smartphones and AI and sensory overload through information technologies. And it's going to be a slog and a struggle for all of these people to keep up. And, or doing it to undercut the system in fundamental ways. That, and again, because none of this is centrally directed through some kind of imperial order, all of this is based off of a consumer model of things, there's no intervening body to say to people, actually, you should go through the period of literacy and the sort of Gutenbergian reality that McLuhan talked about before you transition to these highly advanced information technologies and digital technologies. Because there's going to be huge gaps in your ability to use them and comprehend them relative to the rest of the world. And we already see this. And it's one of those slippery and destructive byproducts of globalization that goes untalked about, because even approaching a sort of ability to talk about these issues labels you like racist and xenophobic or whatever. But that's obviously like a very prescient issue, and I've often been skeptical of the whole like supply side economics, libertarian, rising tide raises all ships sort of thing, because we're dealing with a world of vast disparities and vastly different experiences and approaches to being. But what I'm trying to say is that I don't think an immediate demonization of these things is necessary. But I do think that robbing these technologies of their full potentiality by just using them to service very olden problems and to just placate people instead of engaging with these technologies or even technological beings. If you want to do the whole post-humanist, non-human intelligences thesis that's very popular in academia, or at least it was in the 2010s, very popular. People like Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway, and what was that? I actually attended a lecture once by a leading person who talks about prosthesis. I think her last name was Drake, I think. Her talk was very interesting, I remember. But I remember my political science department was, the theory side of it was very enamored with the whole, like, post-humanism stuff. And, like, critical animal studies and non-human intelligences and how that interacts with a changing political world. I mean, it's sort of it's very innovative to think about, but at the same time, I mean, there's huge bridges between peoples in general around the globe. That globalization is complicated. How do you deal with the other? How do you engage with the other on a global scale? So, yeah, I don't want to immediately demonize these things. But specifically about that point of capital liquidating human relations, this came up in an interview with Nick Land recently by a follower of mine who has this, his name is Vincent Lay, L-E. He has a book, actually, called, what's his book? He linked it in the interview with Nick Land. If you search up on Substack, the Substack Architectonics, so R-A-R, Arc, and I, Tectonics. You'll find a conversation with Nick Land, Part 1, on Kant, the meaning of the human, AI apocalypse, and simulation hypotheses, LLMs, Deleuze and Guattari, Austrian economics, Yarvin, new reaction, China, Gnostic, Calvinism, and much more. Very fascinating interview. I might have this guy on if he would be willing to voice docs. It's called Unknown Lands, his book. Trying to explain, decoding Nick Land's accelerationist philosophy by Vincent Lay from Index Press. Unknown Lands book. And you could go and buy his book. And hopefully you could buy my book one day, soon. So I just wanted to read one passage. There's obviously other passages I might want to read too. So in those classic works, you develop what I'm calling this transcendental materialist critique by tracing the post-Kantian tradition. So again, you cannot know the noumenal realm, but you presuppose that the noumenal realm is the outside of our sort of a posteriori forms of knowing. We get a priori concepts from it if you have a working knowledge of Kantianism, but for our purposes, let's read this part. Critique by tracing the post-Kantian tradition of libidinal materialists like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, and Bataille, all of who are more or less united by the way they seize upon death, or the great outside other, in order to undermine their pretensions to know and exhaust reality. Remember, death is the great unknowing, right? Like the outside, like the coming AI singularity to Nick Land. Within their help, you wage a critique of broadly phenomenological tradition, from Hegel to Heidegger and Derrida, for each recapitulating Kant's more anthropocentric, again, human-centric humanist, or rather knowledge coming from the human, which is the big sort of Copernican turn in philosophy that Kant brings about, that it is the human capacities of the understanding and reason that order and govern reality on the outside, that takes in the material of reality and works it through the processes of the understanding. So Nick Land is complicating this, and of course a lot of these object-oriented ontology people, which, I mean, let's face it, wouldn't be around without Nick Land, even though they don't want to admit it, especially people like Graham Harman, who hates Nick Land with every fiber of his being. A lot of that is indebted to Nick Land's thinking in the CCRU, to imagine the ordering principles of the real in the absence of human consciousness. And people like Mia So and all those people in object-oriented ontology really owe a big debt to Nick Land, in my opinion. But anyways, so the phenomenological tradition that Nick Land is critiquing, from Hegel to Heidegger to Derrida, for either recapturing Kant's more anthropocentric, idealist, and watered-down critique, or for just completely regressing back to full-blown pre-critical metaphysics. I think one way you describe phenomenology in those early works is as, quote, the attempted proof as the impossibility of death, which I think maybe Nick Land was getting from Ernst Becker. But anyways. Well, of course, gets to capitalism and AI later on, but I'll just add, by way of wrapping up these initial remarks, that one of the main reasons why Deleuze and Guattari's account of capitalism as a deterritorializing machine seems to become so central for your critical project in these early works, by which he means the essays in Fang Noumena, is because capitalism marks the most virulent critique of anthropocentrism by confronting us with a coming artificial superintelligence, which, by way of comparison, renders our own intelligence measly, parochial, contingent, and finite. I don't know if you would agree with what I'm characterizing, so yeah, it's a great interview. I highly recommend reading it, but that's a very good point to sum up how Nick Land and accelerationist philosophy, when it comes to AI superintelligence, uses the basic thesis of Deleuze-Guattari in works like Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and of course 1,000 Plateaus, as a deterritorializing machine that liquidates all human relations into use value, into a phenopoly of desires and the creation of desires, and desire as an engine of capital, and lines of flight that break the traditional mold and norms of how people govern themselves, govern their desires, govern each other, so on and so on and so forth. And notice as well how the sort of like hyper-capitalism also fits into the age of disenchantment, as people like Emil Durkheim and Max Weber and so on and so forth have talked about for millennia. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Geo's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every Content Minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.